You're listening to the 49 Carats podcast, a 49ers Goldmine production with Stephanie Sanchez.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another edition of the 49 Carats podcast. I'm your host, Steph, and joining me today on a Friday is Chris Johnson. How's it going today, Chris?
Doing well. How you doing?
I'm not too bad. You know, this time of the year is like excruciatingly like slow. You know, it's tough just from, you know, I entertain myself with football year round, and so like this month of waiting for anything is so like painful for me. But you know, we make the time go by. As you know, we're doing the state of the 49ers and going through all of the different position groups with each episode. Last week talked about the linebackers with Paul Hope. Today, we're going to be talking about the offensive line and, you know, kind of just our expectations. But before we do that, we did find out when the 49ers are going to be reporting to training camp. The rookies, I believe it is July 18th, if I'm not mistaken. And the vets are going to be reporting July 25th. So that is some good news for us. We're that much closer to real football once again. And so, yeah, that's exciting news. And we'll see if I can make it out there for training camp this year, though I'm not making any promises. It'll be kind of tough this time around, but we'll try to make it happen in any case. But let's get to this offensive line. And you know what? I'm kind of bullish on this offensive line going into 2023. Well, I don't know about you, but we'll talk all about it. For me, the biggest plus is continuity. You know, in 2022, the 49ers had 3 new starters, 2 of which had never played at the NFL level prior to the season, really. Or I should say hadn't started at the NFL level prior to the season, and that was Aaron Banks and Spencer Burford. Jake Brendel, who the 49ers had crazy trust in, because in hindsight, like if you look at the fact that, you know, he didn't even play in 2019 or 2020. He played 6 snaps in 2021. And a year later, he's a starting center for the 49ers, you know, like talk about trust and talk about an ascension, right? If I had to grade the offensive line performance in 2022, I think I would give it a solid B. And I think they exceeded my expectations, all things considered, given that they had 3 new starters on the line.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you there. I was actually thinking a solid B, but I would honestly not disagree with someone if they said, you know, I wouldn't push back too hard if someone gave them a B plus. To your point, you know, and looking back at the offensive line's play in 2022, I try to look at it for what it is as opposed to like expectations, because going in, the expectation was that the offensive line was kind of a concern. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about, you know, why some of that even maybe persists even until now. But that being said, though, yeah, my personal expectations, they definitely exceeded them. And I try to take my, you know, expectation out of it when I was trying to assess and give them a grade. I think a solid B is reasonable, but like I said, B plus, I wouldn't hate if someone said that either. I think Chris Forrester has shown himself to be, continuously a good coach. And to your point, that consistency as well, whereas there has been movement from one way or the other with various coaches going and getting different roles on the team or on other squads. He's been in the house for a little bit there, even before really they even announced publicly that he was actually on the staff back in, I think, 2019 when they first kind of made that announcement. But even though he was there before that, he just hadn't mentioned that, probably because of some of his, you know, prior stuff that he was getting over personally. But at any rate, yeah, I think B is a good assessment for them in 2022. And I too feel very optimistic about them this year as well.
And I think we have to remember that to start the season last year, because there were so many new moving parts to the line, it took some time for them to gel, like naturally. It happened sort of as the season went on. So by the time the team rolled out of their bye, just like the rest of the team, like the offensive line was then a well-oiled machine. And they finished as the 8th ranked offensive line in pass blocking efficiency. But you still feel like there's some untapped potential there, right, for the offensive line, especially when you see a team like the Eagles who, dominated in the trenches all year. That certainly helped them get as far as they did. And so going into the 2023, like I do have those big expectations for this unit. I think they have the opportunity to get an A grade when the season is said and done, potentially, and maybe squeezing into that top 5 in pass blocking efficiency. Of course, bearing health, right? Which we know is always tricky for this team, but maybe their depth is even improved. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but do you see the offensive line? I guess like we've sort of answered the question of like, we see this offensive line being better than last year, right?
Oh, certainly. I do, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely see them making improvements, and notably because of, Aaron Banks and Spencer Burford. Aaron Banks obviously had his starts, but Spencer Burford making his rotation that he had with Daniel Brunskill gave him obviously meaningful reps throughout the season. And I know, we're going to talk about that, so I won't jump ahead, but I certainly, to answer your question, think that they're going to definitely be stronger this year.
Yeah, we'll go player by player on this line, but let's quickly get this one guy out of the way because he's so good. It's annoying. Like like you don't even have to talk about him. Like the top dog of the offensive line, Mr. Silverback, Sir Trent Williams. It feels like almost every position on this team has at least like one of those players that the 49ers can set their watch to. You don't even need to talk about them because they're so good. Trent Williams, definitely one of those guys. Fred Warner, Bosa, they hardly need mentioning. Best at his position. I mean, I don't think we can say anything else about, Trent. We're lucky to have him. And so is his guard mate. So we could just like jump right over Trent just because
Sure.
like I think I don't have questions about him,
Sure.
or concerns at all. To me, he's going to be the same guy, if not maybe better than last year. But Aaron Banks certainly benefits from playing next to a guy like Trent Williams. And I don't know what Aaron Banks would look like without Trent next to him, but fortunately, like that's not something we need to worry about for at least, another year or two. But last year, Banks became a full-time starter in his second year. And I remember being a little concerned with the 49ers offensive line last offseason, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't sure that you could put all your eggs in the Aaron Banks basket because in his rookie season, he had only played 5 snaps, so how can you know that he's ready for this role, but clearly the 49ers saw something in practice that maybe the rest of us didn't see that gave them that confidence that he'd be able to replace Laken Tomlinson, who, Tomlinson did great at the at the left guard position, for all the years that he was in San Francisco. So at the end of the day, I feel that Banks, replaced Tomlinson, pretty admirably. Only 2 sacks allowed all season. 1 versus Miami in week 13 and the second versus the Eagles in the NFC Championship game, which like that game could have been worse for all involved. I think like giving up just a sack, I think we'll forgive that. But yeah, I think overall he did a really great job, and I'm looking forward to what he's going to look like in his second year as a full-time starter.
I do as well. And I think that you made a good point when you're talking about, the impact that Trent Williams has there to Aaron Banks's left. It's unknown, right, what he would look like otherwise, but Trent is there. So, we can at least, have the belief that his floor is going to be at least what he provided on the field last year, which was pretty solid. I know that PFF wasn't too kind to the interior offensive line for the 49ers with their 2022 grades. Not that PFF is the Bible, but I'm just simply saying that, from an individual standpoint, they weren't too kind to them. As a unit, we can talk about that in a little bit. But I think that, one thing that potentially we could use as maybe it's not apples, maybe it's apples and oranges, maybe it's oranges and oranges. I don't know. But Laken Tomlinson, right? Laken Tomlinson was a pretty solid player, went and got paid with the Jets after leaving the Niners. He had the opportunity to play alongside Joe Staley, arguably Hall of Fame, left tackle. Trent Williams, definitely Hall of Fame left tackle, and then went over to the Jets and didn't do so hot, didn't do so well in comparison, at the very least, to how he did in San Francisco. Was he a serviceable left guard? Yeah, sure. But was he as good and dominant as he was in San Francisco? No, not so much. So I do believe that a player such as Trent Williams' caliber has the capability to not just lift the overall play, of the offensive line in general, but notably the person that's playing right next to him. So I expect a lot of good things from Aaron Banks. To your point as well, I mean, it's clearly evident that, and I really look at history, and we may talk about this a couple times throughout this conversation this afternoon, but I look to how they brought along certain players. We were not necessarily but a lot of people were out on Aaron Banks because they're like, you drafted this guy this high. He didn't get any run his rookie year. And then now he's a full-time starter. What's going to happen here? And he was solid. So clearly, maybe, with the combination of the Niners, their scouting, their coaching, how they developed him, Chris Forrester's coaching, as well as Trent Williams next to him. Yeah, I feel pretty good about Aaron Banks going into this year.
Yeah, I do too. And we got a couple questions in the chat. So Alberto is asking, in your opinion, do you believe this line got better? And that's something we discussed in the first couple minutes of this pod. And basically, like we both think that they did. And I think it hinges though on the returning players being better than they were last year, and in particular, the new guys from last year, like Aaron Banks and Spencer Burford. I think those guys need to improve. And I feel confident that they will improve. I think the question mark is still on Colton McKivitz, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But as a whole, I do think this line could be better than last year, and certainly maybe even some of their depth. Ricky is asking in the chat here, who would back up Trent if he went down? In the last couple years, that guy has been Jalen Moore. And it just feels like with every year, Jalen Moore is getting more and more pushed aside. Like, I just don't think the team has seen what they need out of him. And quite frankly, like, they haven't needed Jalen Moore to be this, great player because they have Trent Williams, right? Like Jalen Moore obviously is not going to be a starting left tackle on this team anytime soon. But also I just don't know if his level of play is there. So in the past, I would have probably mentioned Jalen Moore, but Matt Pryor, who they signed this offseason, could also be an option, for a left tackle depth as well for this team. But we'll talk more about some of these depth guys in a bit. We're going to keep going down the line here. So now we're at center. And so Jake Brendel, right? Like, I think Jake Brendel is another returning player. And because he's a vet, I don't know if we can really expect him to be better. But I do think that continuity, because I think that's so important on the offensive line, I think him being back helps this offensive line as a whole. So I think we were expecting Brendel to be gone after the season ended. And the 49ers seem to always be okay with letting their offensive linemen walk in free agency, right? Center especially has been like a revolving door in the Shanahan era. We all assume that maybe, he would get picked up by another team. That didn't happen. What was different this time was that, unlike many others who have left, Brendel didn't have a market. So as time passed in free agency, I just imagine the 49ers and Brendel kind of looking at themselves and being like, should we run it back? And, when that happens, and of course, like, if the player was good for you, if that happens, you never pass those opportunities up, right? I think bringing Brendel back was a win-win for both sides. We saw other free agent centers get some nice deals. most of which, like, I don't think the 49ers would have been willing to pay for a center. I thought given the circumstances, it was the right move for the 49ers to bring Brendel back. He isn't perfect by any means, but again, just going back to the continuity and knowing that center is maybe one of the most important positions for the unit as a whole, I think him being back is going to help this offensive line start the season off right where they left off, right? They don't have to go into the season trying to figure each other out because most of them have played full season together already, except for Colton McKivitz, maybe the only guy, but he was also here last year, right? He was just depth. So that being said, I think Brendel being back along with everyone else that's coming back should help the entire unit.
I agree. And I think that also it is possible maybe that Brendel can improve a little bit potentially. You never know. Like, so in 2016, he was on the Cowboys practice squad. From 2016 to 18, he was on the active roster for the Dolphins. 2019, he was on the practice squad for the Broncos. Also got, acquired by the Ravens to their active roster. And then in 2020, he was with the Niners until present. So it's quite possible with him being like the guy and knowing that he is the guy going into, this offseason and into the season, obviously, at center. There might be a comfort there. There may be, since he's, been playing, since he essentially had his first, full year as being a starter last year. He played all those meaningful reps, gaining that experience, getting that feel of the line, so on and so forth. It's possible that he could, settle in and maybe, be more consistent, maybe not so much, improve as, he might be the player he still always has been, but maybe he ends up being more consistent. It's apparent that the Niners have belief and trust and faith in him, bringing him back, giving him a deal. I do agree. Again, the continuity and the consistency is key. The guys on both sides of him he's played with already. One that we'll get to next, obviously, will have a greater role on the offensive line than he did last year, but they have that experience and they played alongside one another. So, this could be, you don't really talk about it like offensive linemen like this. Many times it's, skill position players or quarterbacks and such, but, with his, what is this, this time of being in the league, 7th year in the league or so, he could be actually finally settling in and actually, being the guy. He's actually, the starter. He's the guy. And, we could potentially be talking about him being one of the key aspects of that offensive line as the year goes on next year.
Yeah, I agree. And Brendel ranked 57 in pass blocking grade among all offensive linemen, not just centers. So only San Francisco offensive lineman who ranked higher was Trent Williams, of course. So definitely not bad for the returning center. But at right guard last year was interesting because the 49ers drafted Spencer Burford. He started right away. I'll say this. He was going head-to-head with Daniel Brunskill much of training camp. They were rotating between the two. Every single day, they rotated each other. And so what ended up happening, Daniel Brunskill suffered a hamstring injury in August, which then made way for Burford to, start. He ended up, starting pretty well. Like, he did a good job. So I think he kind of earned the job from there. But in the second half of the year, like the 49ers at times, once Brunskill was healthy, they rotated both of them like in season. And that's not something you normally see. And I thought that was kind of weird just because, again, you go to the continuity factor and for one, Burford is learning. But of course, there were times where Burford did struggle. 4 total sacks allowed on the year. Chris Forster of Burford said, quote, "I would have hoped during the year he would have taken over the position, but he never really did. It was always kind of a nip and tuck between the two of them, and Brunskill had to fill in some games at other positions, so Spence ended up playing more snaps or more plays," end quote. So with that being said, it feels like, Burford got the opportunity mostly because Brunskill either wasn't available or he was playing other positions. Otherwise, maybe Brunskill would have been the starter. But that makes this offseason even more interesting because Brunskill's gone, and now it's just Spencer Burford. And, you can attribute some of Spencer Burford's struggles to, it's his rookie season, maybe going over some of those rookie hurdles. But clearly, like, the 49ers also feel good about putting their eggs in the Burford basket, right, for the long term, because, again, like, they let Brunskill walk this offseason. And, yeah, like, they don't go chasing after their offensive linemen. Like, if they have a market, they're going to let them go. But I still think that's interesting. Clearly, they have a lot of faith in Burford for this year, and he has put on some weight and muscle this offseason. And recently, Chris Forrester this offseason has said, quote, "This year he has come back, looks like a different guy, carrying himself differently. The confidence level, the jump between years 1 and 2 for a player, if they play, is the biggest jump they ever make. This year, I think he's more prepared for the whole process. I think he's ready to make that step. He looks prepared and ready to go," end quote. So it kind of feels like they do have a lot of trust that Burford, the experience that he got in year 1, should, along with this offseason, should help propel him for a bigger year 2.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think that's quite a glowing endorsement and words of support, I should say, as it relates to Chris Forrester's words about Spencer Burford. Coming from someone as well that doesn't like mince words, I think that, Chris Forrester is not going to just say something on the house. You know what I mean? I think that both things potentially could be true, right? So, Burford got some run last year when McKivitz was injured, but then also wasn't good enough. I shouldn't say that. Wasn't playing to the level to where he completely took over the position as Forrester had hoped that he would. But then I also see it in the sense that he was good enough to also get run, if that makes sense. Kind of similar, as confusing as that may have sounded, kind of similar to kind of what I thought about Tamalo Hufunga's rookie year, splitting time with Jaquiski Tart. There may have been some foresight there from the 49ers standpoint to, think that Brunskill would move on or they wouldn't bring him back, or that Spencer Burford was the future at that position, in which case why they, were kind of rotating him in and such. So they had some belief in him then. I do like that he cut his teeth during that rookie year, as opposed to just being out there and having to just like try to, with those mental reps, get over things during drives on the field, no matter what, without a backup plan, with that being Brunskill. So I think that's opportunity for him to build upon from an experience standpoint. And then also, I mean, shoot, we talked about this probably about a month and a half or so ago. I mean, Forrester has identified that these are the guys that going into camp, these will be, this is the line. So, I've thought more about that, would a competition have been healthier at right guard, or if it's better for him to, mentally know that he is, settling in and he should be, owning the position, and that there's high expectations there because we're announcing before training camp even comes along, albeit with bringing over some, free agents, that this is your role to own. So I do have, high expectations for Burford, working on his body, as you mentioned, trying to be more active in the pass blocking game as well in that regard, to anchor and such. So, the expectations are high for these guys, but I do believe that, it's for due reason, because of the consistency, because of how they played last year, and because of the belief that's been demonstrated by the coaching staff.
Yeah, I agree. And look, another reason to feel good about Burford, remember, he played primarily tackle in college. He was playing basically an entirely new position for him and learning the ropes of that on the fly, pretty much, and at the next level, right, in the NFL. So I think another year at that position, playing just that, I think he's going to be ready. And it seems like, certainly he's training up his body to be prepared for a full season. The same thing could have happened to him that happened to Drake Jackson, right? Where he kind of, maybe he hit that rookie wall in the second half of the year. And that's why we saw more rotating with Daniel Brunskill as well. Also a possibility, right? So again, another year, getting his body right, his conditioning right. I think there's reason to be optimistic about Burford. And, I hadn't thought about this before, but like in talking about both Aaron Banks and Spencer Burford and how these are two fairly new guys on this line, but who we think can make a leap. That also can help potentially Jake Brendel, right? Because we talk about Jake Brendel, he's probably reached his ceiling in his career, right? But he's a solid starter on this line. But I think the guys around him can certainly help, much like, we talk about Trent Williams helping, Aaron Banks. Not to say that, Banks and Burford are that good at their position, but, if they improve, certainly it should help the guys around them as well. So that's another reason I think to feel optimistic about the continuity and just some of these guys returning on this line. But the one guy who is not returning is Mike McGlinchey, right? And so as we know, Colton McKivitz has been pegged as the replacement for Mike McGlinchey. I think even as early as last year, I think the 49ers already had this in mind. And certainly when there were reports that the 49ers even considered trading away Mike McGlinchey last season, I think that suggests they would have been comfortable with Colton McKivitz being their starter even as early as last year, right? So clearly they already kind of had this plan set in motion a bit. And so now that McGlinchey is gone, and as expected, he got a big deal now with the Denver Broncos, McKivitz steps in, and it's just so funny because this is another case of a guy who they bring in to this offensive line as like depth, very unassuming, you just think he'll be a depth guy. And the next thing you know, like he's starting. And if it's like all the other stories of this offensive line where guys have come in, they played a backup and then they're pretty good starters. I would probably assume that, yeah, he'll probably be solid too if he falls in line with all the other guys who have been down this path. I think we knew, the 49ers weren't going to be bringing McGlinchey back. And, certainly fans have had a love-hate relationship with McGlinchey, and I totally get it. I think, if we want to ask ourselves, is Colton McKivitz like an upgrade over McGlinchey? I don't know if we know that answer yet, to be quite honest with you. I think it's going to be a give and take, at the right tackle position. Mike McGlinchey, he ranked 87th in pass blocking among all offensive linemen. However, run blocking, he ranked 33rd. So, like, we always knew that McGlinchey, awesome run blocker, not as good a pass blocker. And I think the pass blocking is what pissed fans off the most, because it's like when you miss or you whiff on a pass block, it's obvious, like fans are going to notice. But on the other hand, for run blocking, like that can kind of be forgiven a little bit more. I think that's just how like fans work. It's more noticeable when you miss a pass block. But I think Colton McKivitz is kind of the opposite, right? He's a better pass blocker, but maybe the run blocking is what he's not so good at. That being said, I think the 49ers offensive line as a whole and their run blocking scheme has a way of masking, some of the maybe, the areas of needed improvement for some of the offensive linemen when it comes to their scheme, just because they execute it at a high level. So you might not be the best run blocker, but you'll look really good because the scheme will probably do that for you. And so maybe in that regard, and also the fact that they have the best running back in the league and McCaffrey, maybe they felt like they could afford to bring the right tackle run blocking just a notch down a bit with Colton McKivitz, but clearly the pass blocking needed to improve. So maybe that's the area where McKivitz is an upgrade over McGlinchey.
Yeah, I'm not ready to give a prediction on that either. Whether, I think that McKivitz would be a upgrade over McGlinchey. I too believe that we got to see it. We got to see what it looks like out there. One thing for us to keep in mind is that he didn't arrive here overnight at this spot of being the presumed right tackle, starting right tackle. He got here in 2020. Has been kind of, I don't want to say buried, but he was down the depth chart. He wasn't starting much. He's had 5 starts thus far, due to injury and such at the position. So, it's quite possible that he's just gotten stronger in practice, physically and metaphorically as well. He's also been banging against the number 1 or 2, give or take, or number 3, depending on the time frame, defensive, line and defense and practice and such. So I'm sure that's done a lot to help and improve his quality of play, his footwork from a practice perspective. But of course, it's got to translate, right? So, him being next to Burford, who has had, probably more experience, honestly, from a snaps perspective than even Colton McKivitz has at this point, with Burford being even drafted just last year and being a rookie, that could, provide some assistance in that regard potentially, as well as helping with his play. But I am interested to see, if the reputational impact of Chris Forrester, as I've kind of talked about thus far in our conversation today, translates with Colton McKivitz as well. I think that, Forrester's put together a good line. He's coached those guys well. They've actually graded higher than I expected over the last few years, notably last year, when the team was, I think, 5th in pass block win rate and 10th in run blocking. So as far as, I can see McKivitz maybe having, challenges here and there. Obviously, I think if he can give us at least what McGlinchey gave us, if that's like his, I'm not gonna say ceiling, but that's, if that's more the level of play that we're more familiar with, with McKivitz's level of play, then I think he'd be fine. To your point with the scheming, I think there's ways to make that happen, to kind of mask some of those deficiencies. But there's going to be a lot expected of him from a run blocking standpoint. Personally, I know that the way that, notably why I think Shanahan would never really throw McGlinchey under the bus is I think McGlinchey's kind of the type of offensive lineman that Shanahan ideally likes. He wants more strength in the run blocking game than he does in the pass blocking game. Kind of counter to what my perspective is, and probably many others. I mean, quarterbacks are back to making their money throwing the ball, but I digress. So that being said, I think that if McKivitz can provide similar play in the eyes of the team, in the eyes of Shanahan, he'll be fine.
Yeah, and going back to what you said earlier about, like the 49ers clearly identify who their guys for this offensive line are and who they're going to be, right? So, I would imagine Colton McKivitz is no different, right? He was drafted in 2020. He's been, in the shadows for, 3 years, I guess, preparing for this moment. And again, clearly the 49ers have seen something from him either through practice or in the limited snaps that he has had. They've seen something that would suggest, okay, that we feel good about this guy potentially starting. Last year, he did play some snaps at left tackle in relief of Trent Williams. And as a whole, he played 43 snaps last year at left tackle. He played 26 at right tackle. And I mean, it's not enough snaps to really, gauge how good or bad he's going to be this year. But again, I would assume that the 49ers, if they're anointing him as a starting right tackle, I'd imagine they've seen something that we haven't yet, right? So, I feel optimistic about Colton McKivitz for that reason, because in the past, like when they anoint these guys as, okay, you're going to be the starter this year, usually it has worked out for them, right? So clearly there's something in either their development or them being able to, see someone's talent and, develop them into starters. So, I would assume Colton McKivitz is no different. But let's look at some of the depth. I think it's established that we feel pretty good about the starters on this line, but how about the depth? Did the depth improve this year? And I don't know if that's a question that we can answer quite yet. Certainly I think there's some experience level for some of these guys like Matt Pryor, John Feliciano. They have starting experience in this league, which I think is valuable to have if you're a depth guy, right? So shout out David Lombardi for always putting this depth chart together. And so this always comes in handy for me. But looking at the offensive line here, so we got our starters, and then, we got our second and third level guys here. So Matt Pryor is kind of looks, at least to Lombardi, looks to be the second string left tackle. And so that's why I mentioned him earlier. Jalen Moore, now on the outside looking in, he had those opportunities in the past, but getting phased out a little bit. And I wouldn't be surprised if we actually see, maybe Jalen Moore get cut, this offseason. I think this training camp is going to be huge for Jalen Moore and his, development, and if he sticks around on this team.
Most definitely.
Yeah, and then for center, they also brought in John Feliciano, which this one surprised me a little bit because they brought back Jake Brendel first, and then they signed Feliciano. In the past, they haven't really had a lot of solid center depth. So to get Feliciano, who has been a starter in the past, and I know Brad, the SF Niners, likes him a lot. So I don't know. Maybe Feliciano is one of those guys who can play multiple spots on the line, and maybe he's your new Brunskill. And in that case, that's a pretty good move. But yeah, I guess it was a head scratcher at first because he feels almost too good for depth in a way. And then we have Nick Zakelj, who I think originally he was seen as the eventual starting center for this team when he was originally drafted, and now kind of seen as the right guard backup. So Zakelj, again, another guy who can probably play a couple spots on this line. So he does have positional versatility, something that's, good to keep around. But I don't really know where Zakelj fits, on this line, to be quite honest with you. Again, I'm eager to see how he does in training camp. And, could he be a guy who has a similar path to a Colton McKivitz, where he is very much below the radar his first few years, but then is maybe poised to be a starter, once someone else leaves, right? So really interesting to see where some of these guys will fall.
It is. And to your point a little while ago, I was surprised to hear when John Feliciano was taking snaps during mini camp, because I thought he was actually coming in to compete at guard. So he could be potentially, to your point, one of those players that can play multiple spots on the line. But it'll be interesting. I don't know that all three of those guys from Pryor to Feliciano and Zakelj will make the final roster, the final 53. But I think it seems as if Feliciano will be around, though. I get the impression by the few things that have been said about him and his positional versatility that he brings value in that manner. So in that way, I should say. So it sounds like he'll probably be for sure sticking.
Yeah, I think so too. He's definitely an intriguing option for depth, and could be one of those guys that if someone gets hurt, he might be one of the first to get tapped on the shoulder. But as far as the third string, and seeing how that may shake out, a couple new faces: Joey Fisher, Corey Luciano, Ilma Manning, all of which were undrafted free agent signings this offseason. Solid group of undrafted free agents, but, I recall Matt Miyoko saying he doesn't think any of the undrafted free agents, and, not just from the offensive line, but any of them making the 53, which I don't know if I agree with that completely. But I say that because I think it might be, tough sledding for these guys in particular to crack the 53, but they can stick around on the practice squad if they show well in training camp. Again, like the question I have is Jalen Moore good enough to stick around on this team in general? Like if one of these 3 undrafted free agents are good enough to, maybe push a roster spot, right? Would Jalen Moore be the guy who would get cut, right? I think that's a fair question. So again, training camp is going to be very important. I've seen that Leroy Watson has bulked up, and I've seen a lot of the beat reporters mentioning that he's huge, like 300 pounds huge. But obviously like still in shape, right? Like, so, his body and conditioning has been a huge area of focus, and it makes sense because he was a former tight end. So seeing him now as, working as a tackle, that could be interesting. And they have a few guys who, have gone from tight end to tackle in the past. So, obviously there's a pipeline there for that. To be honest, I don't know much about Keith Ismail. Jason Poe, I know, is one guy who was like a fan favorite and someone who intrigued a lot, but not someone who we hear mentioned too much, right? Maybe training camp, again, like could be a time where we hear Jason Poe mentioned. It's going to be big for him too if he wants to stick around either on the 53 or probably most likely once again the practice squad.
No, I agree. And actually, if it wasn't for so much for the fact that the starting 5 was already pretty much solidified, we may have seen more movement or outside chances of some of these other players, albeit they, whether they're undrafted or, second year or third year players such as Jalen Moore or in Jason Poe in no particular order, actually being able to stick and make it onto the final roster. But for the fact that those 5 are, pretty much in place, it makes it kind of, more unlikely, I feel, that some of those other players are going to have a lot of movement beyond where they are on the depth chart. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it all shakes out, because obviously, the team can't roll with everybody. And to your point, like, Joey Fisher, Leroy Watson, some of those players, like I too don't know as much about them. But it could be possibly candidates that they have been building that they just park on the practice squad to see if they can develop into something later on.
Yeah, exactly. Based on like what we've seen in the past for this team, I think there's good reason to believe that some of these depth guys who were recently drafted by the team will eventually be starting sometime down the line. The question is, who will that guy be, right? I don't think we know enough to make assumptions on that quite yet, but, interesting to talk about for sure. But, Chris, this was fun. Thank you so much for joining me today to discuss the offensive line. Of course, a very interesting position for this team, one that, we all hope will see improvements in 2023. But make sure that you guys like this video if you have not yet. Make sure you guys subscribe if you have not yet. And of course, going to be doing these position reviews before training camp, so make sure you guys continue to tune in for those. But for now, have a good rest of your Friday. Have a great weekend, people. Happy 4th of July. Peace.